Thanks for tuning into Howe's Things, a podcast and radio show from the David A. Howe Public Library right here in Wellsville, New York. I'm Nick Gunning. My guest today is Alex Irvine, a best-selling author whose work spans novels, comic books, graphic novels, games, and animation. And if that isn't enough, he's also a Jeopardy champ. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So you won your first game of Jeopardy in 2015. I have to know, how stressful was that experience?
Well, so it's funny because it's really stressful when you fly out there and you're sitting in the hotel overnight, and then you get up in the morning and you're with all the other contestants on the bus going over to the studio. You get in the green room and you're looking around wondering who you're going to play, when you're going to get to play. And then after, they come in and they talk to you, the backstage crew at Jeopardy is great. And then you walk out onto the set, and that was when everything really changed for me, because I was like, oh, this is just a place. Like, my feet are on the floor and there's the podiums and that's where Trebek is going to be. And okay, I get this now. So yeah, that first game was really fun.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems like being in the space would be intimidating. Be like, oh my gosh, this is the Jeopardy stage. But that was comforting to you, having like a solid spot.
Yeah, I found it was completely the other way around. Yeah, it was because then it was real, and there I was.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, all right, this is it's a place and I'm in it. So let's play.
Yeah.
So yeah, I won the first game, and then the second game, I had him in the second game, and then I talked myself out of the right answer in Final Jeopardy.
Oh, jeez.
The long story, I'll give you the short version of the long story. One of the other contestants in that game was big into art. She talked about art all the time in the green room, and she was wearing a Monet scarf that she talked about having gotten at Giverny and all this. And so and the Final Jeopardy question was on European art. So the question pops up, and it's about an artist who talking about the swirly effects this artist achieved, and a critic was talking about it. And I immediately thought, oh, well, that's got to be Van Gogh.
Right.
It sounds just like, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, no, the whole thing with Van Gogh is that nobody was talking about him while he was alive, and this critic was talking while the artist was still alive. And then there's this Monet scarf, like, in my peripheral vision. And so I spent 30 seconds of, I talked myself right out of it, and then she got it wrong too.
Oh, wow!
Yeah, and the guy who was in third place was the only one who actually answered Van Gogh, and so he won.
Oh, wow! That's a comeback. I mean, that they knew what they were doing when they wrote that music, right? I mean, I would think that music coming on would be intimidating. Did you find that nerve-wracking?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first game, I knew the Final Jeopardy question like right away. I looked at it and I was like, oh, okay, target. And so I wrote down target, and that took 2 seconds, and then I just sat there the rest of the time, waiting for it to be over and trying not to make faces.
Right.
But then, the second one, boy, that was agonizing. And then the truth is, when it was over, I was like, okay, I did that. and it was, I got on the plane saying to myself, I want to win a game.
Yeah.
If I win a game, I'll come home happy.
Oh yeah.
So I won that first game, and then I was kind of irritated at the way I blew the second game, but at the same time, I was like, yeah, I won a game. Now I can go home.
Yeah, but you've got the title. That's the thing. I mean, that's going to be in your obituary, for heaven's sakes. That's a
I know.
That's a title you don't lose. So
yeah, and they call you champ the whole rest of the day after you win a game. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Was there a moment that really hit you like, this is so surreal? Here I am.
Yeah. Everybody has to do this little anecdote thing, and you fill out a little card with a selection of anecdotes, and I wrote about this one time when I used to have these two dogs, and one was smart and one was dumb. And the dumb dog fell in a ravine one time in a river. Oh. And it was late spring, so the river was just booming with snowmelt. Mm-hmm. And so I had to swim across and get this stupid dog. And
it's like a reverse Lassie situation.
Yeah. And so there I am on the other side of the river from where the trail is, trying to figure out how to get back. Because I barely got across in the first place.
Right, yeah.
And I was going to have to carry a dog back. And this was on a section of the Appalachian Trail, place in Maine called Gulf Haggis. And one of the AT Ridgewalkers appears on the bluff at the trailhead.
Okay.
So we were shouting back and forth, and he's pointing me to the easiest spot to get back across. And so I made it back across. It was hairy, but I did it. And got my dumb dog back up onto the trail. And then I climbed up these rocks to get back up there myself. I was talking to the Ridgewalker, and I said, "Did you just happen to wander by?" And he said, "No, your other dog came and got me." and so apparently my smart dog had run all the way back up the trail to the parking lot and like started trying to get people's attention. Wow. And the ridgewalker noticed him and followed him back down the trail. So I was telling Trebek this story, and afterwards he said, "Woof." And so after all my friends saw the episode, they were like, "You got Alex Trebek to bark like a dog."
Yeah.
And I guess and so maybe that's the most memorable thing, really.
I would say, yeah, that definitely counts. All right. Well, thanks for sharing. That's so fun.
It was fun.
Yeah. Well, typically when we start the show, we talk a little, we open up our bookmarks and see what we're reading at the moment. Do you have anything you want to share that you've read recently?
Oh, geez, I'm always reading like 8 or 10 different books at once. And let me see. I've been reading a lot of nonfiction lately because I'm on a couple of different research jags. And so I'm reading this book that came out. Let me see. I got it in my hands right here. Let me see when it came out. Oh, it's 10 years old now. But in honor of baseball opening day, I'm reading a book called Satch, Dizzy, and Rapid Robert about Satchel Paige and Dizzy Dean and barnstorming. Fascinating. Great stuff. And I'm reading a couple of books about spiritualism and weirdo beliefs in the 20th century. One is called Calling the Spirits, History of Seances. And then there's another one that's set in post-war Germany called A Demon Haunted Land. Oh. Those are both pretty cool.
Anything like that we have in the library collection vanishes. They're the things that get stolen the most.
Yep.
I don't know why, but it's true.
Yeah. And there's certain writers that I used to work in bookstores.
Okay.
And, I had one bookstore that I worked at that we stopped stocking Bukowski.
Yeah.
And there are other writers like that too, but it's just everybody would steal them constantly.
Yeah.
I'm reading a couple of novels too. I'm in the middle of everybody's already reading Yad Jassi's next book, but I'm just reading Homegoing right now.
Okay.
Which is terrific. And another book by this writer who writes under the pen name of Zigzag Claiborne. And the book is called Afro Puffs Are the Antennae of the Universe. And this book is a hoot. It's a sequel to another book he wrote called The Brothers Jetstream. They're both totally worth checking out.
I mean, the titles alone are pretty exciting. So, yeah, I believe that.
And the whole books have that same kind of vim, they just zoom right along.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever find, because writing is your profession, do you ever find it difficult to, turn off a more critical side of you? Like, when you're reading other books, do you sort of, pick it apart? Or are you able to just, sit back and relax and enjoy it?
Well, so yes and no. I mean, there are certain books that I approach and that I start reading because I want to see what this writer is up to, and then there are other books that I read just because I kind of, because I kind of heard they're cool or because I'm going to be on a plane for 6 hours. And those books you sort of approach differently.
Yeah.
I'll read, the new Haruki Murakami with a different kind of attention than you read a Jack Reacher novel with or something like that.
Yeah. It's always nice to have a steady flow of the heavy and the light, to sort of offset.
Yeah. And, you can sit and it's kind of fun actually to try to tease apart like a Reacher novel because or a book like that, that is so formulaic, but the guy has figured out exactly how to work the formula.
Oh yeah.
And you just can't stop from turning the pages.
Yeah, it's true. What I always find interesting about the Reacher novels too is that they don't follow any set patterns. I mean, usually, if a novel if it's a series, they're all going to kind of go linear. They're all going to be, in first person or third. But the Reacher novels, it could be at any time in Jack Reacher's life. Sometimes they're third person, sometimes they're first. It's very unusual for a series like that.
Yeah, and especially the first 8 or 10 of them, and then he kind of settled into some patterns. Yeah. And now I guess he's sick of them, and he handed them off to his brother anyway.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah. I think he just didn't want to write them anymore.
Yeah.
But geez, it must be hard to walk away from the money. So
I would say,
else to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's still such big business. I mean, every time another one comes out, the hold list on those things, goes on for days. People just
I'm sure
love them. So yeah. All right. Well, thanks. That's interesting. Thanks for sharing. Let's get into some of the books that you've written.
Okay.
Author Spotlight.
I'd like to start with I knew I was going to say it wrong. Anthropocene Rag. Could you tell us a little bit about this one?
You didn't say it wrong. You said it right.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Anthropocene Rag started off. I first had the glimmer of the idea for that book a long time ago, like in 2002. And at that point, the book was all about this place called Monument City. which appears in Anthropocene Rag, but only in a very different way than I initially imagined.
Okay.
You know, the book as I first imagined it was going to be kind of a biography of Monument City.
Okay.
And, you know, like a classic kind of French modernist flaneurs like walk through this weirdo place.
Yeah, and here it sort of acts a little bit more like the Promised Land, right?
Yeah, and you never actually see it, although it's described a couple of times, but none of the descriptions are actually reliable. So nobody really knows what it looks like, except for Life 7, and he's not giving you the straight story. And then I got more interested in the people who would be doing something like this, and then from there I got more interested in the ways this idea that after the boom, after this kind of unleashed nanotech that begins to self-organize into intelligences, it occurred to me that that these new intelligences would want to understand where they had come from, because everybody wants to understand that, but they don't have stories, and they don't have a history, and so they would naturally turn to the histories and stories of their creators, whom they understand to be us. And so what happens, so Anthropocene Rag is basically the story of this brand new sort of set of infinitely distributed intelligences trying to make sense of the world that we have dropped them into.
Yeah. And
then there are these people who have to live in this world, and they follow this quest to try and get to Monument City and see if it's real.
Yeah. You know, when reading it, one of the things that I kept finding interesting about it is because, I mean, it's, you know, it's obviously the setting is futuristic and it's clearly sci-fi, but it kind of rests on a much older style format where, you know, I kept feeling like it, you know, this band of traveling group, you know, going from place to place. It has that feeling of like an old style, like a fable or a folk tale. And I thought that was a really interesting way to tell that story.
Well, yeah, thanks. And that's certainly part of what I was after, you know, because, I mean, there's a little bit of Huck Finn in it, but there's also, there's at least as much something along the lines of the Canterbury Tales, where, you know, each of the pilgrims has their own story. And I didn't want to just tell the stories sequentially, so I had to sort of chop them up and intermingle them. You know, then the artificial intelligences have their own versions of the story too, and they're trying to, and then the reader gets drawn in, you know, because one of the things that I was thinking about as I was writing this book is that as I was writing the book, I was entering into this conversation, but I was also trying to invite the reader of the book into the conversation. And that sometimes the book does that more directly than others, you know.
Can you talk a little bit about your use of American folklore in the story? Because when I was a kid, I feel like those kind of stories were everywhere. You know, Paul Bunyan and all of that. I mean, that was all over the place. And then I feel like I went 30 years without hearing anything about it. But lately, it seems like, particularly in YA or junior level novels, more and more American folklore is sort of having its day again. What's your interest there? Why'd you decide to use that in this story?
Well, because those stories have been rattling around in my head since I was like 3.
Yeah.
And you're right. You know, you don't see much in the way of people engaging with them. And then one of the funny things that I've noticed over the years is that a lot of the time when you do see someone engaging with American folklore, it's a European writer. And so I wanted to, you know, poke around at those stories and see, you know, which ones still felt, you know, relevant, and also look at the ways in which we have taken some actual historical things and turned them into fables. You know, like the story we tell about Sacagawea is not at all what happened.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And, you know, that's just one example. And so I wanted to kind of float around in that space where history is becoming story, and look at, you know, why we feel the need to do that. And so the 6 main characters in the book who you know, get these golden tickets, they're all kind of doing the same thing too. They're trying to make sense of where they fit into all this. And so, I mean, it seemed like if I was going to write a story that took place from New York to San Francisco and everywhere in between, basically, that I wanted the stories of all those places to be shining through in my story.
Now, is there thoughts to continuing either this narrative or another story set in this world? Because it seems like there's plenty there to do that with.
I mean, yeah, I could. I think, it's a big, spacious world, and there's all kinds of. There's lots of stuff I cut out of the book that would be, you know, lead in various interesting directions. Okay. But I've only ever gone back to a story setting once.
And do you just find that not as rewarding, or you'd rather just, you know, set it and move on?
Well, by the time I have lived with an idea for long enough to actually get it written down in a way that I like it, and then get it out into the world between covers, I've had it with those people.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I think we're all ready to move on and get some distance from each other. One exception is the only sort of high fantasy sword and sorcery thing I ever wrote. I've come back to that one twice.
Okay.
And I've written 3 stories set in that world. But, you know, I mean, I've published maybe 50 other short stories and 10 books maybe, and I just never really want to go back. Except for every once in a while I think, it'd be kind of cool to do, like, my first novel is Scattering of Jades, and it's with this guy and his daughter getting to St. Louis. And every once in a while I think about coming back to that story and picking her up as an adult.
Yeah. And
she's a journalist in San Francisco, I know that. But I don't know what else she's doing. And so, but most of the time, no. I'm done.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now is the era of the reboot and the sequel, right? So maybe now is the time. Before we move on from this book entirely, I have to tell you, I'm also from Michigan, and I picked up on a lot of little Michigan references in there. So I got a chuckle out of every one of those. So.
All right. Did you ever see the Mickey Mouse stencil on the sidewalks in Ann Arbor?
No.
Because that's real.
Oh, really? Okay. No, I've spent plenty of time in Ann Arbor, but no, I didn't know that one.
If you ever get back to Ann Arbor, it may still be there. It's a
cool town.
Yeah, it is. It's on either Liberty or Washington.
Okay.
As you go down the hill past Main Street, like between 1st and 2nd, down toward the theater company, the Performance Network used to be down there.
Sure.
There's one of those parking meters down there is where those Mickey Mouse ears were.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cool image, just waiting for the shadow to land just right. I did like that. That's cool.
I used to stand there looking at it, waiting for the sun to
just looking at your watch for 6 hours.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned some of your use of history in this book, so I want to talk about some of your historical graphic novels, because I have to admit, before I read Far Side of the Moon, the story of Apollo 11's third man, I did not know the name Michael Collins. I mean, that was...
You're not the only one.
I just didn't know that at all. So I'm curious, was that a particular interest of yours? How did that topic come about? How did you get on that project?
I have always loved space.
Yeah.
And like the first time that I ever went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, I don't know if you've ever been there, but you walk in and the front lobby is full of like Gemini and Mercury capsules, and then there, right in the middle of this big entry hallway, is Apollo 11.
Oh wow!
And I'd like burst into tears the first time I saw it. It was just and you can touch it. You can actually, I mean, it's mostly behind plexiglass, but there's this one spot where you can stick your hand in and you can actually, actually touch. And I got goosebumps just talking about it.
I bet.
Right now. So,
a few years back, I interviewed one of the NASA scientists who worked on this mission for the podcast here.
Oh.
And it was, the most interesting thing about it was just hearing like the little mundane things that went into it, you know, just a bunch of people just doing a job, and suddenly, you know, we have people in space. So yeah, it's a fascinating story. But like I said, Michael Collins was not a name I knew. So your graphic novel certainly made me want to learn more. So yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was it's a pretty cool story. Michael Collins' story is a pretty cool story.
Yeah.
And speaking of the Air and Space Museum, he was its first director.
Right.
And I got involved in this. So there's a small press here in Maine called Tilbury House, and one of the guys who was an editor at Tilbury House just reached out to me kind of out of the blue. I hadn't talked to him in a long time. You know, when you're in Maine, you basically run into every other literary person in Maine every so often. And he had this idea about this Apollo 11 book, and we got to talking about Michael Collins and decided that was the angle. And there was a whole other series of these books planned, and I don't think any of the rest of them ever happened. So yeah, then it was great. I got to like dive in and wallow in the sort of history of the Apollo program, and then try and distill it down to like 60 pages for a 10-year-old.
Yeah. Well, I think the format's really effective too. You know, the long, wide graphic novel versus in the traditional side, the limited color and everything. I just think the whole package is really cool.
Yeah, it came out looking really neat.
Yeah,
and and that was, you know, the artist obviously had a huge influence on that, Ben Bishop, and the book's design, doing the pages in landscape, that came straight from Tilbury. And once I had that in my head, you know, then that's when I kind of hit on this idea that each page would be framed. And you can see this in a lot of the backgrounds on the pages, would be framed by the command module orbiting the moon in the background. And so each page is supposed to be one orbit. It's not exact.
I see.
because I think there were 57 orbits.
Okay.
And the book isn't exactly 57 pages,
Yeah.
but I was aiming for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then to tell his whole life, because here's a guy who, like you said, everybody knows Armstrong and Aldrin,
Mm-hmm.
but then they don't get home without Michael Collins.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then his whole story about, because he probably would have walked on the moon if he hadn't had the neck surgery,
Mm-hmm.
and if he hadn't retired after Apollo 11, because
Yeah.
he was in line to go to the moon again.
Yeah.
But he gets back. I mean, can you imagine that? You get within 60 miles of the moon,
Yeah.
and then you fly home, and you're like, okay, done, thanks.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And even his time on Apollo 11, that was kind of a fluke too, wasn't it?
Yeah, because the crews got all shuffled around.
Right. Someone was sick
a
or
couple
something.
of times.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way it all came together was, I guess it was always going to be like that, because no process like that ever runs smooth.
Mm-hmm.
And to be the guy, I'm taken by this moment. This is a moment that almost everybody really responds to in Collins' autobiography. And he talks about the first time that he's alone in Columbia going around the far side of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this moment where he realizes every other human being who has ever existed is over there.
Yeah.
And I'm over here.
Yeah.
And that's something that nobody before or since, that only got to happen one time in human history.
It's
and he's
so
the guy who
strange
did
to
it.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then he goes and does all these other interesting things with his life. I mean, I would love to meet Michael Collins. He's still around.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed reading the book, and we have it in our collection, so listeners,
Excellent.
we can get it. Let's move on to another one of your nonfiction works, and this must have been a massive undertaking, the comic book story of baseball. I mean, how many years of your life did you carve out just researching baseball history for this?
Oh, man, I have been reading about baseball since I was a kid,
Yeah.
so I sort of had some of this stuff in the bank already. But today's opening day, so it's totally apropos that we should be talking about this.
Perfect.
And I'm hoping the Tigers will not be quite so terrible this year. I had this idea. The book came out in 2018, so it was probably the fall of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
I was at New York Comic Con walking around the floor with my agent, and another one of his clients had just launched this book called The Comic Book Story of Beer.
Oh, yeah.
And I was talking to my agent about, the publisher was thinking of doing some other comic book story of XYZ things. And I was like, oh, they should totally do a book about baseball. And he stopped, and he was like, well, baseball was one of the things we talked about the last time I had a call with him, but we didn't know who we would get to write it.
Uh-huh.
And I said, well,
boy, right place,
solve
right
that problem
time for you there, isn't it?
Yeah. So I went home and wrote up a pitch, and they took it, and then I had to find an artist. And so I knew Tom Coker was a baseball fan, and we had previously worked together on Daredevil Noir, and I love his art. And so I called him up, and it was a big project, which is kind of intimidating for artists sometimes.
Yeah.
But we got it figured out, and then he brought in C.P. Smith to do some of the other work, and they kind of had a division of labor where C.P. did a lot of the sort of layouts and backgrounds, and Tom did most of the figures, and they had this cool workflow thing going. By late fall of 2015, I had everything in place, and then it took me about a year and a half to get the script together, and then I was turning it in batches to give Tom and CP time to get ahead and get started on things, and then we were also 10 Speed, the publisher, was this was kind of a new thing for them, and so they were going round and round with Tom and CP about design stuff and layout stuff, and everybody was trying to figure out what everybody else was doing. And it was a really unlike any other book I've ever worked on, because there were so many moving parts, and things kept coming, and things were changing on the fly. And I've worked on books that did that before, but not in this way. Mostly when I've worked on books where a lot of things are changing, it just means I have to rewrite stuff. But in this project, every time something changed, and the art changed, the layout changed, the page structures changed, and so it was a big, big, hairy book.
Well, it's so, it's so informative for one, and I feel like that's a really challenging thing to do. I would assume, to have something that has that many facts in it without feeling like just sort of like an information dump. And it really doesn't, it moves and feels like a graphic novel. So I feel like that would have been particularly hard to do. Did you find yourself having to go back and, cut or rework things to make sure that flow was working?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This is an anecdote from the first book that Tom and I worked on together, but it will illustrate the process of the baseball book too. So I was writing this Daredevil book with Tom, and I had this fight scene in mind. And so I wrote this huge, detailed 2 or 3 page sequence where Daredevil fights all these bad guys in this brewery, and chaos, everything flying everywhere, and I had it all choreographed down to every punch, every kick, and all this stuff, because I had just started writing comics and I didn't know any better, essentially. And Tom calls me up, and it was the first time we'd ever talked on the phone.
Okay.
And we chatted for a while, and then he says, "Hey, so I'm looking at this fight scene that you wrote in this issue. And, just so you know, a lot of time a writer will just kind of go like they fight."
Insert fight here.
And I was like, oh. And so there were moments in the baseball book that were like that too, because there were so many stories I wanted to tell, And then Tom would call me up and say, "Look, I can't fit this many words on a page. Right? There's too many panels."
Yeah.
And so then I would call up 10-Speed and beg them for more pages, and they would say no, and so there's a lot of stuff that is one panel in the book as it is started off as a page.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But I mean, the upside of that is I got a lot of stuff in there because there's so many great stories in baseball, and it does move because Tom and CP have a better visual sense of how comics work than I do, because they're artists and I'm not.
Oh, sure.
So that's one of the keys to making a good comic is everybody has to listen to each other.
Yeah.
So it was great. The book would not exist, obviously, without their ability to take all this history that I wanted to dump into the book and make it comprehensible on the page.
What's your favorite era in baseball history?
Oh boy. So I guess I would have 2 answers to that.
Okay,
And
I'll allow it.
One is I love the late 20s and 30s just because of the the personalities of the game then, and then also because I was a kid, the 80s. I think the 80s as an era in baseball are underrated. I think a lot of the players from the 80s are underrated. The analytics guys will tell you different, but a lot of great things happened in baseball in the 80s. There was a bunch of 300 game winners and various other records that were set, and you had players like Ricky Henderson, and there's nobody like Ricky Henderson in the game anymore. That's why he gets a whole page in the baseball book, because I just adore Ricky Henderson. Plus he's a weirdo, so that makes it more fun to write about him. Yeah. So those would be my 2 favorite eras.
Okay.
The game right now is kind of disappointing because there's so many strikeouts, and everything's a strikeout or a home run. There's not a lot of action on the bases.
Yeah.
I don't know what they can do to address that. They're trying some things in the minors.
I was wondering if that minors or college, if that makes any difference.
Yeah, they're experimenting with banning the shift. They're talking about making the bases a little bit bigger, so that would change by a couple tenths of a second the time it takes to get from base to base.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if they do all that, maybe you could get a sequel out of it.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay.
So many stories. And then after, because a lot of the research reading that I didn't get around to before I had to turn the book in, I'm reading stuff afterwards and thinking, oh no, why couldn't I get that in the book? It was a project that was just always too big for the container I was trying to put it in, but that means that I just stuffed a lot of stuff into it. I had a blast writing that book.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, you can tell. It's definitely on the page because it is a fun read.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
I want to talk a little bit about some of your tie-in work, because this is like a soft part of my heart here, because this was a thing that got me into reading, tie-in fiction, novelizations. That was when I was a kid, I just devoured it, and it really is the thing to kind of turn me into a lifelong reader. And you've just touched so many different franchises here, Marvel, DC, Transformers, Tom Clancy. I actually picked up your Tom Clancy book because that's one that we have in the collection. And I was looking at the back of it, and it was like a pandemic ravishes, and I'm like, no, I don't want to read that. I'm gonna focus on something else. I don't think now's the time. But I'm just curious: are any of these projects that you worked on, what was the thing that you would have, like, 13-year-old you would have been like, I get to write that? That's awesome.
Doctor Strange.
Doctor Strange.
First time I got to write lines for Doctor Strange.
Okay.
It was in a game called Avengers Alliance, and I said to my 12-year-old self that I have arrived.
That's cool.
Yeah. Transformers stuff is fun, but I kind of missed the Transformers when I was a kid, and so I came into that
too,
sideways.
Mm-hmm.
When they offered me those Transformers books, I took them because my son was a big Transformers fan.
Okay.
At the time, my older son.
Yeah.
And so I went and asked him about them, and he was all about Starscream, and so that's one reason why Starscream has the kind of role he does in those books.
Yeah.
That's for my son Ian. That stuff, it's so fun to write because it's all if it meant something to you when you were a kid,
Yeah.
then yeah, you're playing with toys that you have always loved, and you get to try and invite other people in now, which is fantastic. And also, you realize when you're working on this stuff and fans start to respond to it that the passion for all of these story universes, whether it's Marvel or Transformers or Supernatural or any of these other ones, and that's something that you want to reward, you want to live up to, you want to say, okay, these people really love this stuff.
Well, you're tapping into nostalgia with that kind of stuff, so it's a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of your, I feel like I have to ask you about this because one way or another, it feels like we always end up talking about James Patterson on this podcast, for better or worse. So I have to ask you about your experience adapting Patterson and Martin Dugard's The Murder of King Tut into graphic novel. That seems like an unusual project. How did that come about?
Well, I had done a Dungeons and Dragons comic with IDW called Ianto's Tomb, and that was fun. And so then, I was like, okay, guys, what do we do next? And they said, well, we got this Patterson thing, this Murder of King Tut book, and they sent me the book, and I read it, and I was like, okay, yeah, I could do this. It'd be kind of fun, and adapting things to other things is something that I do a lot of. Yeah. The only thing was that Patterson or his people or something like that wanted to read all the scripts as they came through.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
is that why we end with the heroic James Patterson solving the mystery of King Tut in the
end? Yeah, they sent me those pages, and I just had to put them in.
I hope that's true.
Well, the funny thing was that as I was working on this book, literally, I think I was revising the fifth issue.
Okay.
This big article comes out that King Tut's death has been solved, and it obviously was not a murder. And so the book's whole theory goes out the window.
That's problematic. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I thought the whole thing was pretty far fetched anyway, but so I approached it like a kind of alternate history conspiracy take on King Tut, and so I had some fun with it.
Yeah, the book. I mean, the hardcover book is always cataloged as nonfiction, and I'm always kind of like, but is it really?
yeah, it's like Patricia Cornwell when she did her book on Jack the Ripper.
Oh yeah,
a while back, and she decided it was some poor artist schlub, and she bought a bunch of his art and destroyed it, trying to search for clues, and then it turned out it wasn't him after all.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was one of those things, so like people get a theory, and if they have a lot of money and influence, they get to publish their theories. And I mean, I had fun with it, and then I think there was going to be some more Patterson stuff at IDW, and then it fizzled out for whatever reason. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I don't remember anything else happening.
But I'm not sure I would have wanted to do it anyway. But because it was fun once, but it's the kind of thing that is fun once.
Yeah, you can check that off the list. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, looking at your catalog of work, because it covers a lot of different areas, I'm wondering, what's the one that you feel most proud of? So, say if you were a Jeopardy clue and the answer was Alex Irvine was the author of this, what would you like that question to be?
Oh man, the truth is that the things that I have written that everybody talks about how hard it is to get the thing that's in your head actually onto the page.
Yeah.
And all the times that I feel like I've gotten closest to that have been short stories.
Okay.
Which is a drag because nobody reads short stories. But I love writing them. When you get a short story right, there's no feeling like it. You can't ever get a novel right the way you get a short story right.
Oh, interesting.
You can write a good novel. You can even write a great novel. I mean, and I would like to do that someday. but writing a short story, you can actually get to the end of a short story and realize that it is exactly what you wanted it to be. Yeah, so there are some short stories that I've written that I think would stand up along those lines.
Okay.
I'm not done writing novels either, so maybe maybe there's still a novel out there that would be a Jeopardy clue.
Okay. All right.
That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that you failed to answer in the form of a question, but that's okay. Do you have any upcoming projects that you can tease?
Well, let's see. I mean, I'm always working on stuff. And
Sure.
Most of it I can't announce. Most of what I'm working on actually right now is game stuff. I'm working on a new game that is going into open beta in May, I think.
Okay.
And there will be more announcements about it then. And that's fun. It's kind of a science fiction-y kind of co-op loot and shoot kind of game.
Okay.
Like a cross between Halo and Guardians of the Galaxy.
Well, that sounds fun.
Yeah, and I have always working on new stories and new books and everything, and it's but it's weird. I've once I turned in Anthropocene Rag, I went back to working on games, and so now I'm in this spot where I had this book out, and I've had a couple of short stories out since then. I got a novella in the most recent Asimov's called Glitch.
Oh, great. Okay.
I like that story a lot, and I'm glad it came out.
And what is that called?
It's called Glitch.
Okay.
And I don't know if your library gets Asimov's or not, but if you do, it's in there.
All right. Well, what's the best way for people to find you, online or whatever, so they can follow any upcoming stuff?
Oh, well, I'm on, there's a website, alex-irvine.com, which is sporadically updated, but has most of what you'll need to know.
Okay.
And then, I'm on Twitter at Alex Irvine, and you can find me on Facebook and all the various other social platforms. Always happy to chat with people online or answer questions about things I've written or things I might write. So.
Okay. Well, hey, I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. Next time I'm in Ann Arbor, I'm going to go find those Mickey Mouse ears. Now that you told me where
you really have to. Yeah.
I will. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun.
Thanks for tuning into this special interview. If you enjoyed this, you can dive back into the All the Books Show archives at soundcloud.com/allthebooks or wherever you get your podcasts and listen to our special spotlight on Lee Child and his Jack Reacher series, as well as our series of interviews with David Dworkin, a sci-fi author who also worked on several Apollo programs, including Apollo 11. So again, you can find those at soundcloud.com/allthebooks. For more with Alex, you can tune into the companion interview we did for the Previously on X-Men podcast over on the Radio Meanwhile Network. Anyway, thanks for tuning in to How's Things this week, and we'll see you next time.